you hear me? Oh, closer. And he'd been home the night before and said it was the last night home before he shipped out. Then all of a sudden on July 17th, he came home again. So we were young kids. So we went to the movies in Martinez, and we saw Jimmy Cagney flying, and he got hit. And his plane is circling and circling and coming down, but he never landed because Port Chicago blew at that same time.
Wow.
And everyone went out to the theater, and we never thought of Port Chicago. We thought of Benicia, Vallejo, or someplace. First we thought an earthquake, but then a rumor said no, it wasn't an earthquake. So we went back in and watched the rest of the movie. And I lived in Clyde, so as we drove up over the hill, everything was black. There wasn't one light showing. And Frank drove like crazy. And when we got to our little street on Wellington, all the neighbors were out because they knew I was alone and he had left for the service. And he sailed the next day. And by November, his ship got blown up. And he survived that too.
Oh, good.
So there was a lot of this going on.
Thank you. Any other survivors? Yes. You can stand there or you can come up, but people will hear you better if you're on the mic. And then Richard. Okay. Well, you're a survivor of the city of Port Chicago, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was living there at the time. My father was on construction, and he worked down by the docks, and so did my mother as a bookkeeper. They were there the 2 nights before it happened. We're working late, so I'm grateful that they didn't work that night. And I was about 11 years old, and I can remember coming home from a circus or a carnival that was in town, right? Yeah. And I got in bed and started reading a comic book probably. And then all of a sudden the lights went out and I looked up and there was smoke billowing. The frame of the window had come down on top of me. The front door had blown through the house. My mother had to dig me out. And then the most part was we went in the backyard and we looked up and here was all this shrapnel flying over our heads. It was red hot shrapnels. And from then on it was, here we are. Here we are.
Thank you. Thank you. And what's your name?
My name is Gladys, and I didn't know if anybody was there. I was in the Girl Scouts. And is anybody here that was in the Girl Scouts with me in Port Chicago?
And what's your last name?
Oh, Kerr now, but it was Genesi at the time.
Okay, so we got that on film. Thank you. And Richard. Soublé.
Yes, so my name is Richard Soublé, and my father was one of the survivors of Port Chicago. So, interesting story. At the time that the explosion occurred, my father and his unit typically would have been out on the docks to replace Division 11. My father was an NCO in Division 10, which started their shift at 11 o'clock that night. Had he been on the deck and on the dock at the time that he normally was, I wouldn't be here today. That would be the only Soublé son ever. So why wasn't he out there at his normal time? Well, he had bought some new underwear that day. And he was stenciling his name in his underwear, and he told his division, when I get finished, we'll go out. Needless to say, they never got out because the explosion occurred, and it blew him from his bunk through the barracks and into the locker room. And he said once he stepped outside after he got the lockers off of him, it was something that he would never talk about. He would never tell us about it. We didn't learn about this story until we were grown-ups. So as you heard the ranger say earlier today, most of the survivors did not do a lot of talking about what their experiences were. But I know why my dad knew God. Thank you.
Thank you. I have an uncle who served and who was a survivor, and he told me when the explosion happened, it blew him from his bunk against the windows, and he said he fell down on the floor. It happened to many of the guys who were in the barracks because it was 10:18 or 10:17 when it actually happened. So they were preparing to go to sleep. He said that they immediately knew that it was a ship. He didn't feel like it was an enemy that came to attack. And he said that at that time, they all jumped up, checked to see who was okay, and then they immediately went to work taking people to someplace that they could get medical help. And he said for 3 days they worked round the clock. And he said that he was not aware that he had glass in his back until he laid down. And so they were up all that time working. And he said finally he laid down and he said, oh my God, he said something's wrong here. But they immediately worked to help everybody else. And we have some stories for you if any other family members wanted to share anything. Cameron has a story from Robert Rouse. Robert Rouse Jr. explosion, and he was blinded.
So this is an excerpt from an interview with Robert Routh Jr. And it starts with, the interviewer was asking, was that because the ship had already loaded? And Routh begins his story with, there was one ship being loaded and another ship was due in that day that didn't really arrive until around 8 o'clock in the evening. Even so, I probably wouldn't have had anything to do for the next 3 days the way the rotation went. So on this particular day, July 17th, I finished washing. No, I didn't finish washing. My clothes were soaked. At 10 o'clock in the evening, when taps sounded, I put away my gear in my locker, where I had been writing letters and so forth. Being a teenager, 19, and typical of teenagers, there was usually, pimples and so forth. And so I went to wash up and put on Noxzema and get ready to hit the sack. I guess by about 10:20, 10:21, I jumped in my bunk. I had the upper bunk. Bunks were 2 on 2. I had been in my bunk about a minute or two when all hell broke loose with the explosion. And the interviewer said, you heard a bang? A humongous one at that. I had my head, my pillows on my arm, looking in the opposite direction from the dock. And so when the first explosion came, well, I sat up on my arms and I looked towards the dock. You know how the barracks are built with window after window after window. And so at just about the time I looked up, then the second explosion. So I guess in the span of 7-8 seconds, it was all over. But looking toward the docks brought about a devastating problem for me. Flying glass, compression, etc., lacerated my eyes, and the left one was lacerated so badly that it was destroyed that night. But the right one had a laceration that went across the eye and eventually left me with what was referred to as split vision, eventually. In those days, in order to close up any laceration, the common practice was to use sutures. Back then, though, about the scar in both eyes. From that point, the explosion, I was rendered a blind person. And then the interviewer asked, so you couldn't see it? The glass had cut your eyes, you couldn't see anything? You didn't know what happened? And Routh responded, well, I had blurred vision, but I couldn't see well enough to walk and had to be let out and so forth. But it was at night, as I said, such devastation you wouldn't believe. This minute, everything was peaceful and calm and so forth, and the next, the base had been destroyed. You just wouldn't believe it.
And this one is from a Coast Guard enlistee from 1944. His name was Harold Tegner. He said, well, we were just doing our thing, patrolling there, and I was in my bunk because I didn't have to do watch. And the guy on watch said he just passed by there. There's no reason for us to stay way out, so where we were, we used to go pretty close in. He must have been in a boat going in and out, huh? But he just went by the ship, and a couple of minutes later, he was out farther, and that's when the explosion happened. The ships blew up. There was 2 different explosions. Maybe you had 6 or 8 seconds apart. The first one, it was so loud that I thought our boat blew up. I jumped out of my bunk and landed on a bunch of glass and got up and realized that the wheelhouse, the top was blown off. A few seconds later, even after I got up there, all this stuff came down on top of us. I guess tons of oil, black oil, and then whatever else. The interviewer says, from the ships that exploded, Tegner, it covered every one of us from head to foot with oil. We were black. Nobody could even call anybody by name. They couldn't recognize us. Needless to say, we were scared stiff. The interviewer, how close did you say you were then? Several miles away from the pier where the ships were? Oh no, it's not even several miles across there. The guy on watch estimated 300 yards, that's what he said. They came up with something like that. A little island was destroyed. I think it's a mile across there, and we were a lot closer than that. They said that the explosion, of course, if we would have been closer, we would have been killed. If we were farther away, it could have been worse than it had been. The explosion kind of, would you call it, mushroomed over our head, and we were kind of in that high spot, which made the damage less severe. There was a tanker out there, would have had something blown, if there had been a tanker out there, it would have had something blown off. I'm not sure just what. And then a little later he says, our engines were knocked out, no lights or anything, so we dropped the anchor, waited for somebody to come and pick us up. I don't even remember who it was. One of the other patrol boats that picked us up and took us to Benicia there, we were tied up there for a while. There was an ambulance waiting there that took us to Mare Island Hospital. Interviewer says, when did you realize what had happened? Well, it was hard. Actually, when it happened, it just was hard to realize what it was. But after we stood out there, we couldn't see anything. There was no lights. Everything was blown out, even our lights. Roe Island light was blown out. The guy on watch, well, we wouldn't have to tell him. He realized that the ship blew because he knew that they were loading ammo. And then the second ship. Interviewer, so you were taken then to the hospital, Mare Island Naval Hospital? You said that when the first blast occurred, you got out of your bunk and stepped on glass? Stepped on glass? Were your feet cut? Yes, they were. I still remember a nurse in the hospital had big tweezers trying to pull the glass out. I don't recall any pain before that because I was scared stiff, so I wasn't aware. I don't know if it stopped any pain or not. They took us up to the hospital and kept us there for 3 days. Just to look you over and make sure you were okay? He said, that's just about it. Did all 4 of you on the boat that were patrolling, all 4 of you were you still alive and at the hospital? He said, yes. The one guy, the guy that was at the wheel, Robert Dollar, I think he may have gotten the worst of it because he was pretty much more open. The rest of us just had some minor scratches, as I recall. Sometime later, we went on duty. We had to patrol that area to see if we could find anybody. We only found 1. Is that right? Out in the water? It must have been a grim task to go out and do that. And he said, well, the task was not, but when you find what you're looking for, that's what hurt. Just 1, and it was pretty rough, that one. Yes, sir. Robert.